I had always been drawn to the idea of escaping into the wilderness. There was something thrilling about leaving behind the chaos of daily life and immersing myself in the unknown. In the winter of 2017, I decided to take a trip to the Amazon rainforest. I wasn't naive, I knew it would be dangerous. The jungle wasn't a place for tourists looking for comfort. But I wasn't looking for comfort. I wanted solitude, challenge, and the sense of being somewhere untouched by the modern world. I'd heard about a small, abandoned cabin deep in the rainforest, built decades ago by a researcher who had studied the area. It was remote, far from any village or settlement, and that was exactly what I wanted. I didn't tell anyone my exact plans, only mentioning to a couple of friends that I'd be exploring South America for a few weeks. I didn't want anyone trying to talk me out of it or worrying about me. The journey to the cabin was as grueling as I had anticipated. I hired a guide to help me navigate the first leg of the trip, but I made it clear I wanted to be left alone once I reached the cabin. He was a wiry man with sun-weathered skin who barely spoke, but his eyes told me he thought I was crazy. After 2 days of hiking through thick, humid jungle, with insects swarming around me and the cries of unseen animals echoing in the distance, we reached the cabin. It was more run down than I'd expected. The wooden walls were warped from years of exposure to rain and humidity. Vines had crept up one side, and the roof sagged in places. The door was hanging loosely on its hinges, but it was still intact. The guide gave me one last wary look before turning back the way we'd come, leaving me alone. The cabin had a single room with a small cot, a wooden table, and a couple of rickety chairs. There was no electricity, of course, and the only light came from the gaps in the walls and the single small window. I set my bag down and began to unpack. I'd brought a few essentials: a camping stove, non-perishable food, a water filter, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a machete for clearing paths. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the area around the cabin, careful not to stray too far. The jungle was dense and disorienting, and I knew how easy it would be to get lost. I kept a close eye on the sky, using the position of the sun to navigate. The sounds of the rainforest were constant: birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of leaves as animals moved through the undergrowth. On the third day, I found something strange. About half a mile from the cabin, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a circle of stones, blackened as if by fire. Surrounding the circle were wooden stakes driven into the ground, each one topped with what looked like tufts of animal fur. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I told myself it was probably the remnants of some local ritual or ceremony. Still, I decided not to linger and quickly made my way back to the cabin. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The jungle seemed louder than usual, and I kept hearing strange noises, soft rustling outside the cabin, the snap of a twig, the faint sound of something moving through the undergrowth. I told myself it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, barefoot. The prints were faint, but they circled the cabin as if someone had been walking around it repeatedly. My stomach tightened as I realized they hadn't been there the day before. I spent the day on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't leave the cabin, instead staying close and keeping my machete within arm's reach. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that maybe a local had wandered through the area and meant no harm. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were closer. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I sat on the cot, clutching the machete. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and I held my breath, straining to hear. Then came a soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wood. It was slow, deliberate, and chilling. I wanted to call out, to demand whoever it was to leave, but fear kept me silent. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity before stopping abruptly. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously stepped outside. The jungle was still and quiet, but the unease in my chest remained. I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed up my gear, shouldered my bag, and began the trek back towards civilization. As I made my way through the jungle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I would stop and listen, but I heard nothing. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. After several hours of hiking, I reached a river that I had crossed on my way in. I stopped to fill my water bottle, but as I bent down, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Across the river, partially hidden among the trees, was a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild, unkempt hair. He was standing perfectly still, watching me. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but I could see his eyes, dark and unblinking. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the machete. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face and arms. I didn't care about the noise I was making. I just needed to get away. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing where the guide had dropped me off days earlier. My legs were shaking, and I was drenched in sweat, but I didn't stop until I was far enough away to feel safe. I used the satellite phone to call for help, and a rescue team arrived several hours later. To this day, I don't know who the man was or what he wanted. The locals I spoke to afterward had no answers. Some suggested he might have been a hermit living deep in the jungle, while others speculated he could have been part of an uncontacted tribe. But whoever he was, his presence was deliberate, and his intentions were anything but friendly. I never went back to the Amazon. That trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to disconnect from the world. Instead, it became a reminder of how truly vulnerable we are when we step into the unknown. And even now, years later, I can still see his eyes watching me from the shadows, a silent reminder of the danger that lurks where civilization ends. It was late autumn, and the air carried the sharp chill that signaled winter wasn't far off. My Aunt Claire had invited me to a weekend getaway at a cabin she and her husband, Tom, had rented deep in the woods. Tom's stepsister, Megan, would be joining us too. It wasn't unusual for my aunt to plan these little trips, but this time, I felt uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation of the cabin or the fact that Megan and I didn't know each other well. Still, I brushed off my reservations and agreed. The cabin was nestled in the mountains of northern Vermont, a good 4-hour drive from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where cell service was non-existent, and the only sounds you'd hear were the rustling of trees and the occasional animal. We arrived Friday afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. The cabin was older than I expected, with weathered wooden beams and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The driveway was little more than a dirt path, and the surrounding forest seemed to press in on all sides. The place had a strange charm, though, like it had been untouched for decades. Inside, the cabin was simple. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The furniture was old but functional, and the smell of aged wood filled the air. It was cozy, I supposed, but something about it felt off. We settled in quickly. Tom brought in firewood from a pile outside while Claire and Megan unpacked groceries. I explored the cabin, taking in the creaky floorboards and narrow hallways. In one of the bedrooms, I noticed a closet door that didn't quite close all the way. Behind it was a staircase leading down. "There's a basement?" I muttered to myself, peering into the darkness. A faint, damp smell wafted up, and I quickly shut the door. Something about it made my skin crawl. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees and making the cabin feel even more isolated. We gathered in the main room, the fireplace crackling as we played cards and shared stories. Megan was surprisingly friendly, and I started to relax. When it was time for bed, I chose the smaller of the two bedrooms. The bed was lumpy, and the blankets smelled slightly musty, but I was too tired to care. As I drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest outside seemed to grow louder. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and I swore I heard faint footsteps on the wooden porch. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to warm the frosty air. Over breakfast, Tom mentioned exploring the woods, and we all agreed it sounded like a good idea. We spent most of the day hiking. The trees were tall and bare, their branches stretching out like skeletal arms. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, which crunched loudly with every step. We followed a trail that wound through the forest, occasionally stopping to admire the views or snap photos. At one point, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned shed. The wood was rotting, and the roof had partially caved in. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The shed was empty except for a few rusted tools and a pile of animal bones in the corner. They looked like they'd been there for years, bleached white by time. Megan joked that we'd found someone's hunting shack, but the sight of those bones unsettled me. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My unease from the shed hadn't faded, but I kept it to myself. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every now and then, I'd catch Megan or Tom glancing toward the windows, as if they felt it too. Once I thought I saw movement outside, but when I looked again, there was nothing. After everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The cabin felt too quiet, like the silence was waiting for something to break it. Finally, I forced myself to go to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Claire mentioned hearing strange noises during the night. She thought it might be the wind, but the way she said it made me wonder if she believed that herself. Later, while everyone else was outside gathering firewood, I decided to take another look at the basement. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the closet door and descended the narrow staircase. The basement was small and unfinished, with a dirt floor and stone walls. Old tools and crates were stacked in one corner, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly. As I moved the flashlight around, I noticed something odd. There were deep scratches on the walls as if someone or something had been clawing at the stone. My heart raced as I backed up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. That night, the wind howled louder than ever, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. We tried to act normal, playing cards and talking, but the tension was palpable. Just after midnight, we heard it, a loud thud from the porch. Everyone froze. Tom grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The porch was empty, but the snow revealed a set of footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. They stopped right at the door. No one slept that night. We stayed huddled in the main room, the fire burning low as we listened for any sound. At first light, we packed our things and left. The drive down the mountain was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. I never told my aunt what I saw in the basement, and she never mentioned the footprints again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that cabin and the scratches on the walls. Something or someone was out there, and it knew we were inside. It was late autumn, the kind of night when the rain doesn't just fall. It soaks into everything, filling the air with a damp chill that clings to your skin. I was in my early 30s, and I had decided to head out to the woods behind my property to chop some firewood. The rain had started as a drizzle in the afternoon but had picked up into a steady downpour by the evening. My cabin, nestled deep in the forest of western Washington, was remote, a good 10 miles from the nearest paved road. I lived alone, and most nights the isolation didn't bother me. But something about the stormy night had me on edge. I pulled on my thick coat, grabbed my axe, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, and the sound of the rain hitting the trees was almost deafening. My boots squelched against the muddy ground as I made my way to a small clearing about half a mile from the cabin. That's where I usually chopped wood, where the fallen trees were plentiful, and the work felt somewhat organized. The forest at night was always dark, but tonight it was pitch black. The clouds had swallowed the moon, and my flashlight was the only thing cutting through the void. The beam danced across the wet trees, the rain dripping from their branches in long, heavy streams. The farther I walked, the more oppressive the darkness seemed. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, making every sound sharper, every shadow more menacing. Finally, I reached the clearing. The rain had turned the ground into a slick mess of mud and fallen leaves. I set down my flashlight, propping it up on a stump so the beam pointed toward the pile of logs I'd left there the previous week. Picking up my axe, I began to work. The rhythmic thud of the blade sinking into the wood was oddly comforting, drowning out the relentless patter of rain and the rustling of the wind through the trees. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest felt wrong. It was a subtle thing, hard to put into words. The usual sounds of the woods, crickets, distant owls, the occasional rustle of a deer moving through the brush, were absent. Instead, there was an eerie stillness, broken only by the rain and the sound of my axe. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, the axe still in my hands, and strained my ears. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't match. It was deliberate, too heavy for most animals, too light for something like a bear. I turned slowly, my flashlight casting long shadows as I scanned the tree line. Nothing, just the endless rows of dripping trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination, and went back to chopping. But my movements were more hurried now, my senses heightened. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was closer, the sound of something or someone moving through the underbrush, trying to stay quiet but not quite succeeding. My stomach tightened. I set the axe down and picked up the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the rain and the vastness of the forest. No answer. I stood there for a long moment, the rain soaking through my coat, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. When nothing happened, I convinced myself again that it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling or an animal startled by the sound of chopping. I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next time I heard it, the sound was unmistakable, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of my cabin. My heart started pounding in my chest as I swung the flashlight toward the sound. Again, nothing. But this time, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The mud near the edge of the clearing had fresh footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were deep, as if whoever or whatever made them was heavy. They led from the direction of the cabin into the woods and stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the rain and darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet. I felt exposed, standing there in the open. Grabbing my axe, I decided it was time to head back to the cabin. I'd finished enough wood for the night, and I didn't want to stick around to find out who or what was out there. The walk back felt much longer than it should have. Every sound, every shadow, set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone following me. But the forest remained empty, the only movement the swaying trees and falling rain. When I finally saw the warm glow of my cabin through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I quickened my pace, eager to get inside, lock the door, and put this whole night behind me. But as I approached, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The front door was open. I knew I'd closed it when I left. I always did. My hand tightened around the axe as I approached cautiously, my flashlight sweeping across the porch. The door wasn't just open, it was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. I stepped inside, my boots leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. The cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I stood there for a moment, listening. The only sound was the rain on the roof. Then I saw it. On the kitchen table, a single wet footprint. It wasn't mine. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The cabin was small, just one main room and a bedroom in the back. I could see most of it from where I stood, and it looked empty. But I knew better than to let my guard down. I moved slowly, checking every corner, every shadow. The bathroom was empty, the bedroom too. But the window in the bedroom was open, rain blowing in and soaking the floor. I shut it quickly, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside my cabin while I was in the woods. And now they were gone. I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was still racing as I sat down by the fireplace, the axe resting on the floor beside me. I told myself I'd stay awake all night if I had to, that I'd keep watch until morning. But as the hours passed and the storm began to let up, exhaustion overtook me. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, just like before. I grabbed the axe and stood, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, the doorknob turned, rattling against the chair I'd wedged under it. Whoever it was didn't try to force their way in. The knob stopped turning, and the footsteps moved away. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, the forest was empty. The footprints in the mud outside were gone by morning, washed away by the rain. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I'd never be alone in those woods again. I always thought I could handle isolation. I grew up in a small town, and after college, I moved to the city for work, so I wasn't exactly new to quiet nights or long stretches of solitude. But nothing prepared me for the time I spent at my wife's grandma's cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was the summer of 2013, and my wife, Karen, had talked me into visiting her grandmother's old farm property. The place was in the remote outskirts of Arkansas, miles away from any neighbor or proper road. Her grandma had passed away a few years ago, and no one had visited the cabin since. Karen wanted to take a few days to clean it up and decide if we should sell it or keep it as a family retreat. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but Karen seemed attached to the cabin, even though she hadn't been there in years. "It's just a few days," she said. "You'll love how peaceful it is." I wasn't sure how peaceful a crumbling, decades-old cabin surrounded by farmland and woods could be, but I agreed to go. The drive was long, about 5 hours from our place in Little Rock. As we turned onto the gravel road leading to the property, the landscape changed dramatically. The trees grew denser, their branches almost forming a tunnel over the road. Karen pointed out landmarks from her childhood: a broken-down tractor, an ancient oak tree with initials carved into its trunk. But to me, it all looked like the setting of a bad horror movie. When we finally reached the cabin, it looked worse than I expected. The wooden exterior was weathered and gray, with paint peeling off in long strips. The windows were coated in grime, and the roof sagged in places. Surrounding the cabin were overgrown fields and a patch of woods so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet into it. We parked and stepped out of the car. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Karen seemed excited, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Inside, the cabin was just as neglected as the outside. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air smelled stale and musty. The furniture was old and mismatched, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. Karen found an old photo album and started flipping through it, smiling at the memories. I busied myself with unpacking and checking for any immediate repairs we'd need to make. The first night was uneventful, though I didn't sleep well. The bed was uncomfortable, and every creak and groan of the cabin made me sit up, listening. Around midnight, I heard something outside, probably an animal, but it sounded too deliberate, like slow, heavy footsteps. I told myself it was nothing and eventually drifted off. The next day, we spent hours cleaning the cabin. Karen dusted and wiped down surfaces while I tackled the yard. The grass was waist-high in some places, and clearing it felt like an endless task. I found rusted tools, pieces of broken equipment, and an old well hidden beneath a pile of debris. The well was covered with a rotting wooden lid, and when I peered inside, I couldn't see the bottom. That night, the unease I'd felt earlier returned. As we ate dinner by candlelight, the cabin didn't have electricity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods outside seemed darker than the night before, and the silence was oppressive. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a strange noise. It sounded like something scraping against the side of the cabin. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear. The sound stopped, then started again, this time closer to the window. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and shone it outside. The beam of light revealed nothing but the overgrown yard and the edge of the woods. I told myself it was a branch or maybe a raccoon, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the wooden siding near the window. They were too high up to be from an animal like a raccoon or a fox. Karen tried to brush it off, saying the wood was old and probably cracked on its own, but I wasn't convinced. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I'd turn around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. The woods were still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Karen was asleep, so I didn't wake her. I grabbed the flashlight and looked out the window. Again, nothing. But the footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was watching. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to check the yard. The scratches on the siding were deeper, and this time there were footprints in the dirt. They were human. I told Karen we needed to leave. She argued, saying we'd only been there a couple of days and hadn't finished cleaning. But I was adamant. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. We packed up and left within the hour. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, its weathered frame barely visible through the trees. I felt a wave of relief, but also a nagging sense of unfinished business. Months later, we got a call from a neighbor who lived miles away from the cabin. He'd been checking on the property and found the front door wide open. Inside, the furniture was overturned, and the scratches on the walls were worse. Karen and I never went back. The cabin still stands, forgotten and crumbling in the middle of nowhere. Whatever or whoever was out there that summer can keep it. I drove up to the Forest Mountain cabin in late September, just before the leaves turned into a fiery blaze of reds and yellows. The air had that crisp bite to it, signaling the start of autumn, and I was looking forward to the solitude the trip promised. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, tucked deep into the mountains. No cell service, no neighbors, and barely a trail leading up to it. Just the kind of isolation I needed after months of working long hours at my job in the city. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who had offered it to me after I mentioned needing a break. It was old, built sometime in the 1960s, but it had a sturdy look to it. The wood was weathered, but the structure stood firm, and the windows had been recently replaced. Inside, it was basic: a single room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, a worn-out sofa, and a bed in the corner. There was no running water, but a nearby stream provided plenty for washing up. Electricity was limited to a small generator I could run for a few hours at night. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, chopped some wood for the fireplace, and set up my little camping stove for meals. The quiet was almost unnerving at first. I wasn't used to it. Back in the city, there was always some kind of noise: cars, sirens, people. Here, all I could hear was the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. But by the time evening came, I had settled into the stillness, letting it wash over me like a balm. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, reading a book under the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, something I almost ignored. A twig snapping, maybe. Animals were common in these woods, and I figured it was nothing more than a deer or raccoon. But then it came again, closer this time. A deliberate crunch of leaves, followed by a pause. It was the sound of footsteps. I froze, my mind racing. I hadn't seen a single car or person on my way up here. Who would be walking around in the woods at night? Grabbing the flashlight from the table, I turned off the lantern to avoid drawing attention to myself. I moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peered out into the dark. The beam of my flashlight barely pierced the inky blackness outside, but after a few moments, I saw movement. A figure was standing just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by shadows. They weren't moving, just standing there, as if watching the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had lost their way, but something about the stillness of the figure didn't sit right with me. I waited, hoping they would leave, but they didn't. They stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, without warning, they turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing from sight. I locked the door, checked the windows, and spent the rest of the night on edge, listening for any sign of their return. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as some random encounter. Maybe it was a hunter or a camper. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. There were footprints in the dirt leading up to the cabin, large, heavy prints that stopped just a few feet from the front porch. They didn't belong to any animal. These were human. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to busy myself with chores, fetching water from the stream, stacking firewood, but every so often, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt different now. The peaceful silence I had enjoyed the day before seemed oppressive, the shadows between the trees darker and more menacing. That evening, I decided to keep the generator running a little longer than usual, lighting up the cabin to push back the darkness outside. I sat by the fireplace again, but I couldn't focus on my book. My eyes kept darting to the windows, and my ears strained to catch any sound beyond the crackle of the fire. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of leaves, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight and turned it off, plunging the cabin into darkness. Moving to the window, I peeked outside. The figure was back, standing just at the edge of the clearing, closer than the night before. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell they were facing the cabin. watching. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my hunting knife and stormed outside, yelling into the night. My voice sounded small against the vast emptiness of the forest, and the figure didn't move. It was as if they were taunting me, daring me to come closer. Then, slowly, they turned and walked away, vanishing into the woods. I spent the rest of the night clutching the knife, sitting in the corner of the cabin with my back against the wall. Sleep was out of the question. Every noise made me jump, and I kept imagining the figure creeping closer, peering in through the windows, testing the door. When dawn finally broke, I made the decision to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, throwing them into the back of my truck. But as I was about to climb in, I noticed something on the side of the cabin. Deep scratches gouged into the wood, as if someone had dragged a knife or sharp object across it. They hadn't been there the day before. I didn't waste any more time. I started the truck and drove down the narrow dirt road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The feeling of being watched stayed with me until I reached the main road, and even then, I couldn't shake it. When I finally made it back home, I called my friend to tell him what had happened. He was as baffled as I was. He'd never had any issues at the cabin before, and there were no reports of anyone living in the area. He suggested it might have been a prank or someone passing through, but I could hear the unease in his voice. I haven't been back to the cabin since, and I don't think I ever will. The memory of that figure, standing silently in the dark, still haunts me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that they'll always be watching, waiting for someone else to wander into their woods. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 34, single, and worked a demanding desk job in the city. This trip was supposed to be my way of escaping the noise and pressure of daily life. The cabin was isolated, a solid 3-hour drive from the nearest town. That's what drew me to it in the first place, complete solitude. The drive up was uneventful, just long stretches of highway that eventually turned into narrow, winding roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The cabin was small but cozy, with a log exterior, a pitched roof, and a wide porch overlooking a dense forest. Inside, it had the basics: a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room with a stone fireplace. There was no cell service or Wi-Fi, but I had brought books and planned to enjoy the quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and spent the evening reading by the flickering light. The only sounds were the occasional crackle of the fire and the faint rustling of leaves outside. By 10 p.m., I was in bed, wrapped in the thickest blanket I could find. The second day, I decided to explore the area. The woods were beautiful but disorienting. The trees grew so close together that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. I made a mental note to stick close to marked trails. Around noon, I found a small creek and followed it for a while. It was peaceful, and for the first time in months, I felt my stress melting away. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. My front door was slightly ajar. At first, I thought I might not have closed it properly. I went inside and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling that something was off nagged at me. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before settling in for the evening. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was irrational, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks on me. But every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside made my pulse quicken. I slept with a heavy flashlight within arm's reach. On the third day, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. While walking around the property, I found boot prints in the mud. They were fresh, too fresh to be from anyone but me. but they weren't mine. They were larger and led from the woods to the side of the cabin. I followed them, heart pounding. They circled the cabin before disappearing into the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The cabin, which had felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a trap. I went inside, locked the doors, and pulled the curtains tight. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone passing through. But why would they circle the cabin? Why wouldn't they knock or announce themselves? That night was worse. I could hear noises outside, faint footsteps, the crunch of leaves. I wanted to look, to peek through the curtains, but fear rooted me in place. What if they saw me? I stayed up late, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke to the sound of tapping on the window. My heart stopped. It was soft, almost rhythmic, like someone was trying to get my attention. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I sat frozen, barely breathing until the tapping stopped. The next morning, I found more footprints. They led from the woods to the window where I'd heard the tapping. I also noticed small scratches on the wooden frame, as if someone had been trying to pry it open. Panic set in. I had planned to stay for another 2 days, but I knew I had to leave. I packed my things in record time, keeping an eye on the forest through the windows. As I loaded my car, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I got in the car and started the engine, ready to leave this nightmare behind. The narrow dirt road leading back to the main highway felt endless. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. About 5 miles out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the road was a piece of fabric. It was navy blue, the same color as the hoodie I had left on the porch railing the day before. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. It wasn't until I reached the highway that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. Back home, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, that someone had been in the woods, maybe even in the cabin, with me. A week later, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was my navy hoodie, neatly folded, and a note that read, "You left this behind." It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a week alone at my family's old cabin. Nestled deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, the place was a relic of my childhood. My dad had built it with his brothers back in the 1980s. A sturdy, no-frills retreat meant for fishing trips and hunting seasons. Over the years, it had become a quiet getaway for our family, though it was rarely used anymore. At 28, I'd been looking for some solitude. My job in the city was draining me, and my personal life was a mess. The cabin seemed like the perfect place to unwind, disconnect, and think. I packed light, just some canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, my pocket knife, and my trusty old sleeping bag. The plan was to hike the mile from the trailhead to the cabin, spend the week reading and relaxing, and maybe do some light hiking in the surrounding woods. The cabin sat in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines and oaks. The nearest neighbor was miles away. It was small and rustic, just a single room with a loft for sleeping. The exterior was weathered but sturdy, and the inside smelled of aged wood and faint mildew. The only electricity came from a solar panel my dad had installed years ago, which barely powered a single light bulb and an ancient radio. There was no running water, just a well pump out back, and the bathroom was a creaky outhouse 50 yards from the cabin. When I arrived, everything was just as I remembered it. The clearing was overgrown, and the cabin had a slightly more neglected look, but it was still standing strong. I unlocked the heavy padlock on the door and stepped inside. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the small windows, and I could see the marks of time. Cracks in the wood, cobwebs in the corners, and a faint musty smell that told me no one had been here for a while. I set down my backpack and began to tidy up. I swept the floor, wiped down the old table, and checked the loft for critters. A few mouse droppings here and there, but nothing major. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a fire going in the small wood stove, and the cabin felt warm and cozy. I settled in for the night, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in months. The first night was uneventful, though I struggled to fall asleep. The sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant owl, felt louder than I remembered. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the dark. I reminded myself that I was alone out here, miles from anyone, and eventually drifted off. I woke early the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and instant coffee, I decided to explore the area. I followed an old deer trail that wound through the woods behind the cabin, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that blocked out most of the sky. It was beautiful, but there was an odd stillness to it, like the woods were holding their breath. I chalked it up to my city-bred nerves and kept walking. After about an hour, I came across a small clearing with a dilapidated hunting blind. It looked ancient, the wood rotting and the structure leaning precariously. I didn't linger, feeling an odd unease I couldn't quite place. I headed back to the cabin, telling myself it was just my imagination. That night, I had trouble sleeping again. The forest sounds seemed quieter, almost muted. Around midnight, I woke to a faint noise outside, like twigs snapping. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it through the window. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the breeze. I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, and forced myself to go back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I spent the morning chopping wood and tidying up, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. Around noon, I decided to check the perimeter of the clearing. That's when I found it. A series of faint footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of the woods. They were human, barefoot, and far larger than my own. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was probably an old print, maybe even one of my own from years ago. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The print was fresh, the edges still crisp. I followed the tracks a short distance into the woods before they disappeared into the underbrush. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I locked the cabin door that night and barricaded it with a chair, just in case. I barely slept that night. Around 2 a.m., I heard the noise again. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It was closer this time, circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I gripped my flashlight and pocket knife, sitting in the dark, straining to hear. Suddenly, there was a soft thud against the wall. Then another. My breath caught in my throat. I shone the flashlight toward the window but saw nothing. The noises stopped, and the silence was deafening. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what was out there. When the sun rose, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and prepared to hike back to the trailhead. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The clearing was littered with strange marks. Long, shallow scratches in the dirt, as if someone had dragged a stick or a claw through it. Near the edge of the woods, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked. It hadn't been there the day before. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and started the hike back to my car. The entire way, I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached the car, threw my bag in the back, and sped away. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I told my family about the strange noises and the footprints, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably a bear or my imagination. Maybe they're right, but I can't forget the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence of the woods, and those footprints, far too large and human to ignore. The cabin still stands, but I'll never set foot in those woods again. Something was out there with me that week, and I don't want to know what it was.